Thank you very much. So yeah, as has been mentioned, I've done interviews and I'm meant to have gone through them all by now. But I haven't quite got through all of them. And I've finished the interview. So when I was meant to speak, I think it was like the beginning of December, I wouldn't have actually finished the interviews. I now have finished the interviews, and I now have the lengthy job of going through all the transcripts and figuring out what the main trends are and what recommendations I'm going to make. So this is essentially a project looking at the relationships between UN peacekeeping missions and other actors who are operating in the same spaces. So I'm looking at the relationship between the UN peace operation and other UN actors, so other UN funds, agencies, and programs that will be working as part of the same country team, international NGOs, local NGOs, civil society that are also delivering humanitarian assistance, undertaking peace building programs, etc. And also the relationship with the host state, because that has been a shifting relationship in a number of different missions over the last decade or so. And there's been some work that has been published on NGOs and the UN and that relationship. There's also been a little bit done on the host state and how that has changed as a result of stabilization missions. But there hasn't been any work on the UN side of things, and particularly the NGO side. It's very difficult to find um, research that is up to date on that. There was one study done for the Folk Bernadotte Academy about 5 years ago. But before that, looking through the literature, you're looking at stuff 10, 20 years ago of the UN NGO relationships. So that's really the gap that I was looking to fill, and I made that pitch to a funder, the British International Studies Association, and they gave me the money to be able to go and do the qualitative research. Um, so I'll start by explaining a little bit about the types of peacekeeping missions that we've seen over the last decade or so. I'll run through a little bit about robustness and militarization, and what those concepts mean in peacekeeping, what those missions have looked like, and particularly what the impact of that is. So the impact for the law of armed conflict, the impact of counterterrorism, that the UN has been kind of in some way linked to, particularly in Mali. And then I'll go on to talk about those different partnerships and ultimately the interviews and some of the key trends that came out of those, and also some examples, because some of the participants gave some really good examples of their relationship with the UN, or the UN's relationship with another actor. So to make a start on kind of like the types of peacekeeping that we've seen, for those of you who don't do peacekeeping every day, or maybe you studied peacekeeping a while ago, or were involved with peacekeeping, because Canada is obviously has a history in UN peacekeeping, but you haven't been involved in it lately. We've now seen since kind of the late 2000s into the early 2010s, a real shift in the language for more robust and militarized peacekeeping. So the main examples that I've looked at in my research and are in my book are Mali, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. But there's also the DRC, and these are missions that have increasingly used more force. They're missions that have been, apart from South Sudan, although I make the argument it is a stabilization mission, the other three have stabilization in their titles, and there's been questions about what that means. So, what does robustness actually mean? Well, in the Brahimi report in 2000 and the Capstone Doctrine in 2008, the UN said that peacekeepers had to be made more capable. They had to be able to defend themselves, they had to be able to defend components of the mission, and they must have robust rules of engagement. And that's really the start of this this trend. So in the 2000s, calls for peacekeepers to be able to, respond to threats to both the mission and ultimately civilians under a protection of civilian mandate. In 2017, the UN published some guidelines on the use of force, where they said that peacekeepers should not wait for a hostile to attack civilians or UN personnel before they use the appropriate level of force to prevent that violence. They must be proactive using force. And the UN says that this is mainly for credibility, that they have to be able to proactively use force to make their presence felt, to be able to have credibility, particularly with the local population, that those peacekeepers present will take action in the interest of protection. So robustness essentially became all about presence, posture, and profile. And the UN in 2009 said that they published like a concept note on on robust peacekeeping, and they said that it's about posture rather than a specific activity. So if you go through all the UN documents, you won't find a list of activities that make up robust peacekeeping. They keep it as a much more flexible concept by saying that it is a posture, it's an image of those UN peacekeepers, that they're meant to make their presence felt, and if needed, that presence is felt through the use of force. Now, there's been concerns about robust peacekeeping, and particularly humanitarian organizations, international NGOs have said that robust peacekeeping means that the armed groups that are having robust peacekeeping used against them will retaliate against the softer targets. If the UN is then a hard target that is more capable of using force, then they're not really easy pickings, are they? Who are the NGOs that are delivering humanitarian assistance and don't have weapons. So humanitarian organizations said, well, we don't really want peacekeepers out there using more and more force because that is actually going to increase conflict in that environment and put us in danger. So UN peacekeepers in the 2010s were seen to, in quite a lot of the literature and the UN's reporting itself, to actually engage in more military action. And that has led to discussions about how peacekeeping has become more militarized because of this capability aspect. To be able to have that posture of robustness, you have to have the capability to have that posture, and that capability comes from increased militarization, professionalism of that personnel, the training of that personnel to be able to be robust. So one definition of militarization is the intensification of labor and resources allocated to military purposes, including the shaping of other institutions in synchrony with military goals. And that's something that has been talked about in peacekeeping in terms of peacekeeping with its protection of civilian mandates, with specific units being deployed, particularly by Western countries in Mali, that actually there is a more clearly defined military goal and purpose that those peacekeepers are serving, rather than simply being present. And that is ultimately all geared towards being more robust, having their presence felt by armed groups to deter that violence in the long term. So the UN has increasingly devoted more and more resources to strengthening the military capabilities of its peacekeepers. So Mali is the main example, because various NATO countries deployed to Mali. So the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Norway, the UK, all deployed different specialist capabilities to Mali. And some of my interviewees served with MINUSMA and were part of those specific capabilities where the UN had access to Western military hardware Western troops that were, instead of just being infantry, they were specialized units able to, for example, the UK sent the Long Range Reconnaissance Group that are able to operate hundreds of miles beyond UN bases for certain periods of time, which gives the mission much more scope to be able to reach communities that they haven't been able to before. And that is a specific capability, a militarized capability that was provided by the UK to the UN. Now, NATO also carries some other burdens with it when NATO countries deploy to UN missions, because they have rules around intelligence and medical assistance. So you have to be able to follow NATO evacuation for medical assistance. There's various intelligence classifications that mean they might not be able to share intelligence gathered with other countries as part of a UN mission. So there was lots of complicating factors of this so-called militarization and involvement, particularly of NATO countries. But ultimately, these missions are arguably on their way out. So throughout the 2010s, we actually even saw African countries calling for more robustness, more use of force, and this appetite for actually engaging non-state actors in warfare, and peacekeepers going and using force against those non-state actors often came from African states, and you'll be able to read into the reasons for that. Obviously, some of those African states will be neighbors to the country that is hosting the mission, and there'll be destabilization, there'll be economic implications for the conflict continuing. And also the Force Intervention Brigade that was deployed in the DRC in 2013, which has a mandate to neutralize armed groups. So that mandate is actually to go out and use force proactively, and to actually hunt down armed groups alongside the host state military. It's unique in the peacekeeping world. That's not something that has been replicated in other missions. That brigade was actually deployed at the request of 3 African countries: Malawi, South Africa, and Tanzania. So this isn't just a Western thing. This isn't something that is purely being driven by France, the UK, and the US on the Security Council. This is actually something that has, I'm not going to say that there's consensus, but there's definitely a group of states that are both North and South that are driving for more robust peacekeeping. There are also a group of states that are saying, actually, you know what, we won't do more robust peacekeeping. And actually, with the mission in Mali closing month and a half ago on the 31st of December, and discussions ongoing about how MONUSCO will draw down and exit the DRC, there's quite a lot of doubt being cast on the future of these big missions that cost quite a lot of money to have a robust posture. So these are the few missions that have been, I suppose, the most robust. And obviously, these are big missions of over 10,000 personnel. And they also often have mandates to what's called extend state authority, which is interesting for my project because that brings the mission closer to the host state. And I asked participants about, what implications has that had for your relationship with the UN? Because missions that have a mandate to extend state authority are arguably taking a side in that conflict. They're designating the host state as the legitimate authority, and then the UN actually undertakes various state building activities, conducts joint operations with the host state, and then what does that mean for NGOs, particularly for local NGOs and civil society? Has that changed the perception at all of the UN, particularly around the UN's engagement with communities? Is the UN being seen as more of a state supporting actor, and that state might be continuing to commit various abuses? And has that damaged the UN's legitimacy? So that's one train of questions that I asked participants. So just to talk about some of the consequences that we've seen from these types of missions, we have consequences for the law of armed conflict. So in 2015, the high-level panel on peace operations at the UN said that where the UN strays into enforcement action and is actually using more proactive force, they must be respecting the law of armed conflict, and it may make them a party to the conflict. But the UN Office of Legal Affairs has consistently said that it cannot be a party to the conflict, as it's not a high contracting power to the Geneva Conventions. And the UN hasn't really moved past this. The report says, well, you might be a party to the conflict if you go using force against non-state actors, but then we also have the UN saying no, we can't be, and that's mainly because the UN is trying to protect the non-combatant status of its peacekeepers. But nevertheless, where the UN is actually using more force, particularly if it's conducting a joint operation alongside host state armed forces. For example, that force intervention brigade in MONUSCO is widely believed by international lawyers to be a party to the conflict, because it is conducting those joint operations alongside a party to the conflict. It would be nonsensical to say that those UN forces are non-combatants, but the state forces are. So there's questions here about where's that line crossed, if we are having peacekeeping that is using more and more force, where actually is that tipping point between not being a party to the conflict and being a party to the conflict? And that's something that can have a consequence for those relationships and those partnerships, particularly with humanitarian organizations, because of their neutrality, and that they don't want to be seen to be taking sides in the conflict. Host state cooperation, I've kind of already mentioned, because where the UN is being drawn closer and closer to the state and is engaging in state building activities, working alongside ministries, working alongside local government, and then ultimately the armed forces of the state, that impartial nature of UN peacekeeping comes into question. Counterterrorism is an interesting one, which mainly featured in Mali. And this is something that I talked quite a lot about with participants that had been in Mali, either on the UN's side of things or looking at the UN from the outside. Because counterterrorism is something that the high-level panel in 2015 said that the UN should not be doing, should not be conducting counterterrorism operations, and that where the UN is present alongside other forces that are conducting counterterrorism operations, it should be clearly, there should be a clear division of labor between those organizations. But what happened in Mali was that obviously the French forces present using force against various what they deemed to be terrorist organizations, and the UN strayed, tried to stay away from using the terminology terrorist organizations to label the armed groups in Mali, so that it wasn't getting drawn into this counterterrorism rhetoric that the French government and the Malian government at the time, because there's been two coups since then, that were obviously they were using that to combat terrorism in the territory. And then there was also a regional force, the G5 Sahel, and the UN was the mission MINUSMA was specifically given a mandate by the Security Council to provide operational and logistical support to that force. I've argued in some of my other work, it will be out later this year, but if anyone's interested in the responsibility of international organizations, the preprint is posted online. And I argue that where the UN has knowledge of wrongful conduct of abuses being committed by the G5 forces, host state forces, that it is providing operational and logistical support to, I say that they can have shared responsibility for that wrongful conduct. And that's something that has come out of Mali, and MINUSMA also had specific intelligence units, so the All Sources Information Fusion Unit, and there it became clear in maybe it was like 2017 or so that they were providing that intelligence to the French forces. So the because of the NATO information sharing, it was NATO units collecting that intelligence, but they were wearing blue berets, and they were then passing that intelligence to France as a NATO ally, and that is very problematic for the UN's impartiality. So other missions, other actors that the UN works with, there's obviously the wider UN country team, so other UN funds, agencies, programs that are present, and I've spoken to people that work in various different funds, agencies, and programs in a variety of different roles, who have engaged with and interacted with the UN peacekeeping missions, either from afar, where actually they work at HQ level and they're managing, say, teams that are working in country, or people that have had roles in the field. And this cooperation is usually coordinated by OCHA, and participants had some differing views on how efficient that is, and particularly the bureaucracy around the mission and other actors and how they interact and the processes they have to go through. Also, competing interests, where a lot of the programs and funds are trying to satisfy a donor, whereas the peacekeeping mission has more freedom in terms of the resources that it's able to use without donor oversight, and that can cause some tensions in those relationships and some difficulties in where they need to collaborate. There's also international NGOs present, working in the same spaces, trying to work with the same communities, particularly where the peacekeeping mission is undertaking peace building activities or quick impact projects as well. I asked quite a few of my participants about quick impact projects, because quick impact projects for the UN, for the mission, are a way of building their legitimacy with the community. What can we do that's quite quick, that we have the money for, that can make a life-changing difference to a community, that then makes us look good, is essentially the logic of a quick impact project, and then helps build some trust with those communities because we've given them something useful. And that was also a talking point with participants from NGOs, because obviously they have a long-term footprint in a lot of these countries, and the NGOs will be there after the UN has left, either last year or in 10 years. So they were very critical of the UN doing these short-term projects to make themselves look good, and that could at times conflict with what the NGOs were trying to achieve in the wider humanitarian community. So we talked about, how do those negotiations happen? Do they happen? Does the UN even tell you when they're going to be doing some kind of quick impact project, and they know that you're working in the same state, the same region of the country? There's also local NGOs and civil society. They also might be implementing partners for some of the UN funds and agencies. So we kind of have like a triad relationship of where we might have a local NGO that is implementing a project for, say, UN Women, and then they might also have interactions with the peacekeeping mission. Now, they are more difficult to access for a Western researcher, and I've had a couple of interviews, but not as many as with other actors, which are particularly the NGOs in the UN, international NGOs and the UN. So that's something that I need to think about, of whether or not it's something that I actually talk about in the project. If I go away and try to do some more interviews on that, I'll have to see what material I've got when I go through all of the transcripts. And then we've spoken about the host state already. So the project did 31 interviews so far. Maybe that number will increase when I identify the gaps and find some people to talk to. Now, I spoke to people who worked for the UN across different departments, funds, agencies, programs, both civilian and military, and they were asked a variety of things and semi-structured. So I kind of wanted to learn about their experiences and particularly gather, examples of those kind of real relationships that they had as part of their role, whether previous or current, and to discuss really what worked well in those relationships and what were the straining factors. So what was actually the driving force between those organizations, and what made that relationship work or not work. And we often talked about the impact of those issues that I've covered, so robustness and militarization and the closer relationship with the host state, and has that changed how that, if it's a non-UN organization, has that changed how that organization perceives and works with the UN? And these are some of the initial trends. So there's a few different things that have come out. Obviously, there will be way more examples when I actually come to write this up, but I've noted down some major examples that I'll tell you about in a second. So one trend, but UN agencies were typically more willing to seek force protection from peacekeepers as compared to international NGOs. So when I was talking to participants who worked for UN agencies, they weren't always positive about having UN peacekeepers, uniformed peacekeepers, there to provide force protection, but they definitely saw the need for it, and where necessary, were more willing to engage with the mission to ask for force protection and be part of those planning discussions. And that was really one really interesting feature, is how willing were these different organizations to share information with the mission. And the UN agencies were definitely more willing to share information about what they were doing and what they were up to, where they were working. And then ultimately that led to those agencies being more willing to say, yeah, we definitely think we need force protection for this project that we're going to be implementing. And this is very much rooted in the blue versus the black UN. That was something that came up quite a lot. The black UN is the the peacekeeping mission with the white vehicles with the black UN stenciled on the side, whereas the blue UN are the humanitarian funds, agencies, and programs. And that was a very, very clear distinction that came out of all of the interviews, was that the participants very much had an identity, that they were blue UN or black UN, depending on where they worked, and that influenced those relationships, crossing the divide between the blue and the black UN. So there were definitely clear processes in place for agencies, funds, and programs to work with the peacekeeping mission and to go through OCHA leadership and various clusters and meetings that would be held for the UN country team. But there were definitely competing interests, and particularly for the different funds, there's donors at play, and they have an influential role. And agencies will often work closely with local NGOs who may be less trusting of UN uniform personnel, and that would impact that relationship as well. So it was very much a shifting relationship, that in some circumstances it would be fine for UNICEF to ask for force protection and have uniform peacekeepers there. At other times, it wouldn't be appropriate. And mainly the UN staff on both sides kind of appreciated that, that's part and parcel of the job. And we know where we're not wanted, but no hard feelings. That's not a problem. I also found that UNDP provides training on conflict prevention, including to peacekeeping staff, and that was one example that was mentioned as a way of building those relationships. The fact that they have shared trainings across different funds, agencies, departments is able to bridge that gap a little bit between the blue and the black. There's also a large disconnect, I'll call it a disconnect, between the UN and international NGOs. Many international NGO staff reported that UN peacekeeping staff had very little appreciation for the importance of distance and neutrality for international NGO safety, and that there was often a lot of explaining that had to be done to make it clear to the black UN that no, we don't want you around because you're a target. Peacekeepers, particularly in Mali, DRC, have been targeted and killed, and the INGOs felt that they had to, really make that message clear that no, we do not want you around because actually you're bringing the threat to us. So that was what was coming from participants from INGOs. But when I spoke to UN staff, they explained that they fully appreciated the need for neutrality. So there was something that I didn't see myself from the UN. So there seems to be some crossed wires there. And there was something that often participants joked about, was the fact that there were career-wise staunch humanitarians who work for INGOs and staunch UN civil servant types, and that often drives that disconnect. And missions can also be very different. So participants reported a very positive relationship between INGOs and the UN in the Central African Republic, and that was a really that was a mission that was really positive in terms of openness and collaboration and working together and knowing what each other's up to and supporting each other. Whereas in Mali, we have a much more negative relationship. So one participant reported that their driver was shot by French forces because they had driven up near to French forces. French forces had, as part of their rules of engagement, that they could fire on anyone that they saw as a threat. But the NGO had no idea that the French forces were in the area, and they opened fire on the NGO vehicle. They injured the driver, and the participant reported that they went and spoke to the UN and asked for evacuation of that driver to their home country, and that it was part of the UN's mandate to assist with that. And they hit a brick wall, and they found it very difficult to get the UN to act and to support that humanitarian organization in that crisis. So then we also have, I asked participants about mandate terminology and that extension of state authority, that robustness, and so on. And most of them said that that wasn't really an issue. The actual terminology in the mandate is not really a concern. It's more about the people and the leadership, and that actually, if you have the right representative of the Secretary General, if you have the right team leaders, the right military head of the mission, and so on, then you can work better with the mission and trust those people. And the mandate terminology, particularly for INGOs, is not really all that big of a deal. So, for example, one participant was talking about the UN mission in Afghanistan, which is not a peacekeeping mission, it's a political mission. But they were discussing how their predecessor in their role had to liaise with ISAF, and the ISAF officers were not they were very negative in their interactions with this UN person, because the UN person treated them the same as any other armed actor. So they treated them the same as the Taliban, and essentially gave them data on the civilian harm that they had done, and the UN had documented, and said, this is what you need to be aware of, this is the damage you're doing, end of conversation. And my participant said that, well, they took a different approach and went into the room and said, no, we want to work together on this data. We want to make sure this is 100% accurate. We want to know if you have verified this civilian damage, this civilian harm, and was able to then build a more positive relationship that ultimately then brings dividends on being able to work with ISAF on its civilian harm mitigation. There's also a distrust between humanitarian actors and uniformed peacekeepers. So not just a disconnect between the UN mission on a whole, but specifically a distrust of uniformed personnel, to the point that they would often be excluded from meetings. So I had a couple of participants report that there would be INGOs, local NGOs invited to the UN compound for protection cluster meetings or meetings about improving human rights compliance, etc., etc., etc. And there would be no one in uniform in those meetings, because it would be seen as we don't trust those people to be there. So one participant who's a military planner explained that they couldn't understand why these actors wouldn't want that person there, specifically because if a call comes in asking for force protection, they need to have been able to plan that, and it would make the response much more efficient if the planner the officer had known that the INGO was going to be in that town at that time. And then would be able to have forces ready to respond if there was a problem, and couldn't understand, why the NGOs wouldn't just simply be open to sharing that information so that, they were aware, and that the peacekeepers were aware. So that was something else that came out of these interviews. The thing that, I like to think of it as participants were using it as a quite a simple answer, was that personalities were part of the problem, and that it was simply the fact that they didn't get along with someone on the other side, their counterpart in the UN or their counterpart in the NGO or the host state. They just simply didn't get along with those people, and that meant they didn't have a positive relationship. And I then obviously tried to dig past that to actually uncover specific examples that might actually go beyond just a personality problem. Uniformed peacekeepers were very much eager to cooperate. Every uniformed peacekeeper that I spoke to was positive about wanting to complete the mission positively to achieve a set of targets, and understood that those other actors working in those spaces, be they UN agencies, the host state, INGOs, etc., are going to be an integral part of achieving that goal. And that's probably because the military is very goal orientated, but there was a very clear understanding that no, we cannot do this in isolation. There is a much bigger picture here that we are here to support. So that was something that came out of multiple interviews with uniformed peacekeepers. But uniformed peacekeepers reported that there was very much a misunderstanding, a lack of clear planning between their troop contributing country and what the reality was in the UN mission once they were actually deployed, which then impacted being able to work with other actors, because they were going in being told that they were doing A, and they would get there and be told that they were actually doing B. And that meant that all of their preparation and their handover and their training was actually directed in a different direction, that then impacted them, not being prepared for the conflict environment to work with particular actors that were active in the same spaces. So two examples on that. There were some police officers that were deployed to South Sudan, and were given a clear mandate from the troop contributing country. They were told that they were being deployed to do community policing on the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan. But when they arrived, they told the UNPOL commissioner that they wanted to go into the protection of civilian sites and talk to the communities, because how else do you do community peacekeeping? Community policing, and build trust in the community without actually physically going and talking to people. And they were met with, what do you mean you want to go on to the protection of civilian sites? No, we just stand at the gates and we watch what people are doing as they're coming and going in and out of the site. But no, we do not actually engage with the people that live there. So there was a big disconnect between what the troop contributing government had told these peacekeepers they were going to be doing, and then actually how that played out in practice, and then that impacts the wider relationships of who you're working with, how you're then going to work with organizations if you don't have the full buy-in from leadership. So we're linking back to this leadership problem again. And then the UK deployment to Mali was called Operation Nukem, and I was told that there were a cycle of commanding officers, because obviously the deployment rotated. I think there was about 5 or 6 different commanding officers that were in charge of Operation Nukem, and I was told very clearly that there was a cycle of what the focus was, from detention, that UK forces, the long range reconnaissance group, was going there to detain people, to working with the civilian population, and then the next CO would be detention, and then working with the civilian population, and then back to detention again. And that meant that the people I spoke to who worked as part of the long range reconnaissance group, that meant they were not prepared to go and work with organizations that had connections to the local population, the INGOs, the local NGOs, civil society, because they were getting handovers from the last commanding officer that went out there and arrested people and didn't work with those organizations. So that was setting back, them being able to build and then sustain relationships with other actors. There was also mixed responses on the impact of all those things I talked about, the robustness, the militarization. There were some participants that said that yes, it has had an impact. It's changed our relationship. It's made us more wary. It's made us concerned about the image of being next to peacekeepers, of working in the same spaces as peacekeepers. But there were others that said it hadn't really made a difference at all. And what I can kind of read into that is that it often hinged on the level of trust between the interviewee and the UN. So say they were someone from outside the UN, and I was asking them about whether or not they thought that robustness and militarization was having an impact. The participants that were less trusting of the UN were obviously then the ones that said, well, yes, it has had an impact and it's changed our relationships. There was a bit of a division there. But there were many interviewees who were very hopeful about having a more positive relationship, and that there could be things that were changed, and gave me suggestions on how they could work better together as a group, all essentially aiming to achieve similar, if not the same, goals. So these are things that I'm still working out of really, is there anything that we can do? So there's definitely going to be some areas that I look into around training, both for the troop contributing countries and for UN staff in general, and particularly that leadership aspect and building trust at the mission and HQ levels seems to be really important to kind of try to bridge that gap. So I'm still working all of this out, and essentially the outcome of the project is going to be something academic, an article, but then also I'm going to be doing a policy brief that will go out to everyone I've interviewed. And participants some of them were fairly excited about that, and they were like, oh, I'm interested to see what you are going to suggest, because the people I was talking to often then, they don't have consistent relationships with other actors. So they said, no, you're actually going to talk to all of these different people. So it'll be really interesting to see what these other people have said and how you kind of bring that all together. So yeah, we'll see what I come up with in terms of the actual full findings. But hopefully that gave you a good idea of what the project is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'll just give you a little bit of context. I worked in peacekeeping missions in the Balkans on the ground, and I worked on the ground in Guinea on the border between Sierra Leone and Liberia. And so I have kind of a familiarity with this kind of environment. So I have, and also more on the perspective from the humanitarian. So I kind of have 3 points that I'd be interested in your reaction to. The first, I think, from the humanitarian perspective, more robust peacekeeping missions are problematic because they put humanitarians at risk. It's not just that they're sitting beside Black UN, that they're targeted, their clients are targeted, the assistance is targeted, and they're not able to deliver humanitarian assistance to those who need it. The second is that the abuses by peacekeepers of community members as part of some of the robust engagement undermines trust, and there's very little accountability between UN peacekeeping, robust peacekeeping missions and community members. And the third, I think the humanitarian community would say that these more robust peacekeeping operations are unsuccessful in terms of their military as well as their political objectives because they adopt a very kind of narrow military perspective rather than a human security one. And so I was just a bit surprised that some of this kind of perspective from the humanitarian community, who are critically important actors in these contexts and have been, as you say, are there before the peacekeepers and after, maybe wasn't reflected a little bit more in your presentation. And I'd just be interested in your reaction. Thanks.
Yeah, I honestly I was quite interested with that as well. There were some humanitarians I spoke to that were very clear that there had been a negative impact and there was that risk from robustness. And people actually didn't mention the accountability aspect for SEA. That wasn't something that came out of the flow of discussion. Even where I was asking, what do you think have been the positives and negatives of recent changes in missions? And that actually, I don't think at all came up, apart from I think there was one or two interviewees that mentioned that, and that was quite surprising for me as well, because obviously I didn't want to go in with these are the set things that I definitely want to drill into because I wanted to see what they saw as those negatives, and I wasn't completely direct at the beginning of my questioning around that to kind of see what that immediate perception was of these different actors. And I was genuinely quite surprised that actually it wasn't more widely shared that there was definitely this risk aspect. And there were several humanitarian participants who said that, well, often we need that bigger mission, and that bigger mission does play a genuine important role, and as long as they're happy to stay away from us, then we have no problem with them being there. And I found that quite interesting that there was this division in the humanitarian participants, the ones that said that there was definitely a risk, and the others that said, well, actually in these conflicts they are serving a purpose, and as long as we're far away from them, we don't mind. So that was quite interesting.
Did you have any follow-up to that, Val, before we move on?
I just wondered in terms of sexual abuse and exploitation, whether you interviewed any community members, right? Because that's where that would come out. And I think that one of the other things that I would just reflect on is that division within the humanitarian community has always been there. And definitely, I think most humanitarian actors recognize the complexity of these environments and the need for some sort of overall security. It just becomes a problem if they're wearing a UN hat and then the security is also UN. But these are incredibly complex contexts. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, the only participants, I only had a couple participants that were local civil society level, and actually on the ground at that community level, which is a flaw of how I recruited participants, and it's something that I'm now looking at whether or not I need to dig deeper, and unfortunately the main opportunities I have to talk to more civil society is actually through UN and INGO participants who have offered to connect me with those people. So that yeah, that still won't necessarily give me the full picture, which is inevitably impossible. So
Ed, go ahead.
Thank you. I used to coach and teach civil military cooperation in the Pearson Peacekeeping Center for a good number of years. and I used to coach our CIFPOL, intercultural communication and cross-cultural communication, which is important when you are dealing with the local populations. I am currently an adjunct professor at NPSIA in Carleton University. My question to you is the peacekeeping industry, if I can call it, has been a Euro-Caucasian domain for a very long time. Currently, some African countries are having their hand and their chance to donate, to make available peacekeepers as well. In your expert opinion, do you think that there is enough training? Because that's the name of the game. We used to use the iceberg example that when you see someone, you see his dress, you talk to him, that's only 20%. The iceberg is 80% submerged. So this is what cross-cultural communication training will actually bring. So what from your experience, how well trained are the peacekeepers, be it the traditional donors of peacekeepers and the new emerging African peacekeeping missions? Thank you.
So I can't speak to this comprehensively. So I don't work on peacekeeping training. And I have a really good friend who does, David Curran, who works in the UK and does a lot on training aspects. But what I can say is that there were participants, that particularly uniformed participants, who were from countries that don't typically contribute to peacekeeping. So I had an Irish peacekeeper who had a very clear understanding of what they were there for, because Ireland have contributed to peacekeeping for a very long time, and they have a peacekeeping training school, and it is part of their military culture. And that person's said that they can be named in the research, so I can talk about who that is. But the participants, for uniform participants that don't come from countries that typically contribute, and maybe haven't done so since the 90s, or do so, eclectically, they did talk about, that's where that disconnect comes from, of the TCCs having a different understanding of what that mission is going to be, and then the reality on the ground. And that really came out in the UK examples of where UK deployed both police officers and military personnel who had not really very good training at all in advance of being deployed, and hadn't served with the UN previously. And there's very little institutional knowledge that's been retained within the UK forces. That's something that was mentioned as well, because it's not something the UK has done consistently for a long time. So some of that has been lost. And we do, aside from the project, at my institution at the University of Reading, we do a course for British Army legal officers, and I give a morning class on peacekeeping to these officers, because some of them might end up serving as legal officers in UN missions. And there was someone sat in this training who said that they had served as a legal officer with a UN mission, and they wished they'd had even just this, one morning class before their deployment, because they actually got very little in terms of pre-deployment training from the British Army, and that they really didn't understand the context of peacekeeping. So it's not even, to that deeper level of civil military cooperation and so on in a UN environment that's missing. It's actually even the building blocks. And this person reported that, well, actually, we didn't really understand what the UN was even trying to achieve. So it's even at a more basic level. of going into a completely different culture and working environment and not being prepared for that, which is a shame, really. And it's something that was then actually reflected with some of the participants in this project, that really had not a misunderstanding, but they just simply weren't prepared for what they then had to do in their role as a peacekeeper.
Thank you.
Jean.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm trying to make sense of your results, especially regarding the relationship, the partnerships between peacekeeping missions and INGOs, because I mean, when you start describing the robustness, you show something that has to do with policy, with rules of engagement, with the type of troops, with the type of units, specific training, I assume also equipment, standard operating procedures, relationship with the state, and so on. So a whole bunch of extremely, I would say, hard factors. And yet, what appears to be the key driver of the poor relationship between INGOs and the missions seem to revolve around leadership, personality, trust. So you were talking of a disconnect. I think there's a big disconnect there, because the robustness you're talking about is overwhelmingly institutional, material, and kinetic, to speak like the. So, and then people say, oh, as if all this could be dealt with proper leadership and a nice guy that I can trust. So I have a problem understanding basically your results and basically assessing their validity. See, is there not a big misperception? I mean, do you really think that a commander with the kind of units from the UK forces that you describe, that his personality matters that much? See, so there seems to be a disconnect between this psychological leadership mechanism and basically what underlies the increased robustness of peacekeeping.
Yeah, I set out to dig into whether or not those mandates have had a tangible impact on those relationships, and then actually what I found out, even after the first few interviews, was that it wasn't a real driver. It was for some, and particularly some individuals who were perhaps at a slightly higher level in their organization that were dealing with policy did have concerns about those changes in mandates to extend state authority to use robust force, and it was also excuse me it was also very divided in terms of different missions, and the participants that had worked in Mali had a very negative view. I spoke to some people that had worked in DRC, and particularly the INGOs, had a very big risk factor of the changes in mandates, the fact that the Force Intervention Brigade can neutralize armed groups. So it didn't seem to be universal just leadership issues, or we've got a problem with the UN overall. A lot of the INGO participants saw it as very mission dependent, and that they then moved on, because obviously a lot of the people I spoke to have had 5-6 different jobs engaging with multiple different missions, and were able to reflect that, well, okay, I had a bad experience 2009 to 2013 in this mission, but then I had a really positive relationship with the UN 2014 to 16 in this other mission, and that some participants were able to reflect on those mandate changes, and the ones that had worked in multiple missions over a decade or longer, there were some examples of participants that were able to say, yes, there's been a clear shift. But it's difficult when you're recruiting participants to get enough people that have worked in multiple missions over a long period of time. So some people had obviously had shorter careers. Some people had actually worked for other countries or INGOs and then moved over to the UN. So that has been a massive challenge of this project, is particularly how I'm going to bring that together as I write up the results. Because what I'm talking about are some really quite diverse experiences of these people's working lives, and how they've engaged with different organizations, particularly in those soft areas around leadership and personalities. And I did, after like the first like 2 or 3 interviews, when there were people saying, oh well, the easy answer is to say that there's personality problems, I did obviously then try to dig past that. But it's something that I felt like I need to mention that when I talk about this project, because it's something that came up again and again. And then I would obviously push the participant past that to actually discuss those different frictions, and what worked well in those relationships. So yeah, it's something that obviously these are kind of like the headlines that I've put on that slide of the main trends. And yes, that personality aspect is a main trend that I need to find some way of connecting that to the rest of those findings. And I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that yet, if I'm completely honest, because it's difficult when you're talking about such a wide array of experiences, because it's not as if I was talking to people that were on the exact opposite sides. I wasn't talking to the counterpart of the person that had the same experience. I'm talking to 30 people that have worked across 10 different missions over the last 15 years, and it is difficult to bring that together.
Thank you. So my quick question, you touched on this a little bit, is I kind of, when you're talking about the peacekeepers becoming parties, and then I'm thinking about, well, you have humanitarian organizations that have to deal with parties to a conflict neutrally. So there's no kind of, it would, once they cross that line to becoming a party, then it would fundamentally have to change the relationship potentially with how the actors are working and how they manage that. Did you talk about that at all? Or, I'd just be fascinated to hear about that.
So there were INGO participants that essentially said, as soon as more robust force is used and whether or not they're a party to the conflict is drawn into question, we want nothing to do with them. And we won't engage with the uniformed peacekeepers at all, and they will then draw a very clear distinction between the blue and the black, and only deal with the humanitarian funds, agencies and programs. And there were a couple of participants that said that was a concern in Mali, and that there were serious discussions around whether or not they should continue any kind of cooperation with MINUSMA, whereas that wasn't so much, it wasn't an organizational concern that, oh, we don't want to be seen with the UN at all. Being seen with UNICEF is fine, but there was a very clear to differentiate between those different parts of the UN, where the peacekeepers were being more proactive in the use of force.
Yeah, and I can imagine the complexity of, the UN force. UNICEF shows up with the uniform folks, and then you have to figure out how you're managing the relationship in any given moment would be a challenge.
And one of my participants was I think they've put on their form that they're to be identified as a legal advisor at a INGO, and a lot of their role was to actually give a legal opinion on whether or not the organization would be breaching its neutrality if it did X, Y, and Z with the UN or other actors. And that was something that came up in DRC and in Mali, that they were asked for a legal opinion on whether or not they could continue work that they had ongoing with the UN mission.
Thanks, Teddy. Turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's nice to finally meet you. I think we emailed it a while ago. I guess I had one question, which is a little bit tied to what a couple of colleagues had asked before, because I was actually thinking about your project in terms of what is going on in Haiti, whereas, you know, the Kenyans have now agreed to deploy on a peacekeeping mission with the help of some Caribbean countries. And can you tell us a little bit about variation within a case? So has there been any learning done? Did you look at cases where there were repeated missions and where you would talk to people over time and see whether there's any learning? Because I've heard a lot about variation across cases, and Val asked about a case in the Balkans. You looked at different cases across Africa, but did you systematically ask that question about, you know, same, like not the same people, but obviously different missions, but happening repeatedly in the same country, and whether that makes any difference at all? Like, is there any learning that takes place in this?
So I didn't specifically ask about countries that had, repeated missions or missions that had been, rehatted or anything like that. But I did talk to participants in the UN Department of Peace Operations that did mention the various processes that they have for institutional learning, and the teams that they have in the department that are tasked with, learning lessons from different missions, particularly when they close. And that is something that I was a bit critical of, well, sure, you're looking at missions that have closed, but what about, missions that have been going on for over a decade, that are, constantly shifting conflict environments? Surely you need to be, constantly learning lessons from those, engagements and uses of force and all sorts. And I got, pushback of, the UN party line that, no, we do institutional learning, and, we do engage with the different missions to see what works well and what doesn't. But what was definitely missing was cross engagement between the UN and those other actors to learn lessons. And I did ask a couple of participants about that as we followed the chain of questioning, of, well, if you're learning lessons, is that a way that you have in your role engaged with NGOs and host states and so on? And the answer was, I think, no in both instances, was that no, this is actually more of an internal UN process, rather than something that we engage with stakeholders and people that we've engaged with in those missions and worked with, which is obviously probably going to feature in what I write up, because that is, limiting the long-term change and improvement of those missions, and future missions that are deployed, because it's contributing to that disconnect between the UN and the other actors, that they're not on the same page, even though they're often there pursuing similar goals, because they're not even, having that recap and learning lessons together afterwards. And that, links to the NGOs that were saying, well, we're there for the long term, and we know the UN's not, and that engagement with the UN stops when they leave.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, let me also thank you for being a speaker in this seminar series. We're very happy to listen to you. Obviously, this is a very important topic, as I can see from the comments that have been put in the chat. So hopefully we'll get a chance to read your publication in the near future, and maybe more work will come out of it. So all the best to you, and thanks again on behalf of NPSIA.